Everyone assumes getting drunk is a modern indulgence, something invented by bored teenagers or restless aristocrats with too much free time on their hands. That assumption is almost completely backwards. The evidence suggests our ancestors were chasing a buzz long before they were chasing prey, and the actual story is genuinely stranger than anything you would guess. Because here is the question nobody thinks to ask. Why does the human body know what to do with alcohol at all? Not vaguely, not accidentally, specifically, efficiently, in a way that looks less like an unfortunate biological accident and more like a feature that somebody or something actually selected for. And once you start pulling on that thread, the whole tidy story of alcohol as a recent human invention starts to fall apart, and the idea of drinking as a modern habit starts to look almost absurd. Let us start with the body, because the body remembers things documents never bothered to write down. In 2014, a team of researchers led by biologist Matthew Kerrigan published a study tracing the evolutionary history of a single gene called ADH4, which produces an enzyme responsible for breaking down ethanol in the digestive tract. By comparing this gene across dozens of primate species, the team found something remarkable. Roughly 10 million years ago, in the shared ancestor of humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas, this gene underwent a single mutation that made the resulting enzyme roughly 40 times more efficient at metabolizing alcohol than the version carried by earlier ancestors. 40 times, not a small tweak. A staggering biochemical upgrade, and it happened almost exactly when our ancestors were coming down out of the trees. So why does that timing matter so much? Because up in the canopy, fruit gets eaten while it is still fresh. On the forest floor, fruit lies around fermenting in the heat for days, and the more it ferments, the more ethanol it contains. An ancestor that could metabolize that ethanol quickly and safely had access to a calorie source that intoxicated, weakened, or catastrophically impaired its rivals. A considerably darker kind of advantage than tastes good. This is the core of what biologist Robert Dudley named the drunken monkey hypothesis. Not that our ancestors were seeking intoxication for its own sake, but that the ability to handle alcohol efficiently was a survival advantage, and the pleasant buzz was simply a side effect that stuck around because it kept working. 10 million years before the first human being ever fermented anything on purpose, evolution had already built the hardware for it. Let that sit for a second. The desire came preloaded. And this is not just a story about extinct ancestors we have to reconstruct secondhand from bones and genes. In 2015, primatologist Kimberly Hawkins and colleagues documented wild chimpanzees in Bossou, Guinea, repeatedly drinking fermented raffia palm sap with an ethanol content of roughly 3%, using leaves folded into makeshift drinking tools to do it. This was not a single odd chimpanzee having a strange afternoon. It was repeated, observed, deliberate behavior across multiple individuals in the same community. Our closest living relatives are still doing, in the wild, right now, more or less exactly what the ADH4 mutation equipped their ancestors and ours to do 10 million years ago. The habit never actually went anywhere. We just eventually put it in a bottle. Now fast forward almost the entire span of that 10 million years, past the earliest stone tools, past fire, past language itself, to somewhere around 13,000 years ago at a site called Raqefet Cave in what is now northern Israel. There, archaeologist Danny Nadell and colleagues examined stone mortars used by Natufian foragers, a hunter-gatherer culture that existed just before the invention of agriculture. Residue analysis on those mortars revealed starch granules, consistent with malting and fermenting wild wheat and barley into a primitive beer. This was thousands of years before anyone planted a deliberate crop of grain for bread. Some researchers now argue the reverse of what you probably learned in school. Beer may not have followed agriculture. Beer may have helped cause it. And the pattern does not stop there. Move forward again to roughly 7,000 years before the Common Era, to a Neolithic village called Jiahu in China. where biomolecular archaeologist Patrick McGovern analyzed residue soaked into ancient pottery jars. What he found was a fermented beverage made from a startlingly deliberate cocktail, rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit or wild grape, combined with what appears to be real intention rather than accident. This is one of the earliest confirmed fermented drinks in the archaeological record, and it did not happen once. Similar residues keep turning up in different regions in different centuries, made from whatever local ingredient happened to ferment best. Grapes in the Caucasus, rice in Asia, honey nearly everywhere honeybees existed. Different ingredients, same underlying behavior appearing again and again like it was never really optional. By the time you reach recorded history, the pattern has not faded, it has formalized into policy. The workers who built the pyramids at Giza were not paid in currency. Excavations led by archaeologist Mark Lenner uncovered evidence that laborers received a daily beer ration, thick, nutritious, and central enough to the workforce that some researchers describe it as closer to a wage than a beverage. There is something considerably darker embedded in that detail than a friendly workplace perk. A ration measured out carefully enough to keep a brutal workforce compliant and returning each morning. Around the same broad era, the Sumerians composed the hymn to Ninkasi, a set of instructions for brewing beer addressed to their goddess of the craft, effectively a recipe preserved through worship because the process was considered sacred enough to protect. Alcohol was not hiding at the margins of these societies. It was load-bearing infrastructure, embedded in labor, religion, and record-keeping alike. So here is where the myth deserves a closer look, because ancient humans were constantly drunk is not quite what any of this evidence says. The archaeological and ethnographic record actually points somewhere more interesting than nonstop intoxication. In most traditional societies studied by anthropologists, alcohol was not a private, individual habit poured freely at will. It was almost always social, ritualized, and bound up with specific occasions, harvest celebrations, coming-of-age rites, funerals, alliance building between groups. Not the frat party our imaginations tend to reach for, something closer to a shared, deliberately structured technology. For bonding, for grief, for celebration, deployed with more intention than the stereotype gives our ancestors credit for. That distinction matters because it changes the entire shape of the story. This was not a species stumbling around in a permanent haze. This was a species that inherited 10 million years in advance the biological machinery for something it would not actually build a culture around until an almost unimaginably long time later. And then built that culture with more structure, more ritual, and more social precision than most people assume. There is something quietly beautiful in that gap, a species carrying around a gift for 10 million years before it finally understood what the gift was for. The gene came first, the purpose came later. And somewhere in between, across 10 million years of fermenting fruit, malted grain, and honeyed jars buried in Neolithic villages, a species slowly figured out what to do with a body that was already quietly waiting for it. If that changed how you picture your ancestors, you already know where the subscribe button is.